The Avengers would stand out in the boys' universe almost immediately because none of them fit the system Vought spent years building. Tony is technology the company didn't create. Thor is genuinely from another world. Hulk's powers have nothing to do with Compound V, while Steve, Natasha, and Clint have spent years fighting without needing a brand or sponsorship attached to it. Vought would want answers before the public started asking the same questions. At first, the Avengers wouldn't know enough to see the problem. The Seven look like an established superhero team. Vought presents itself as the organization keeping them coordinated, and Homelander is treated like the most trusted hero on the planet. But that image would start falling apart once Tony and Natasha begin looking into how Vought actually operates. From there, 6 people who already know what a superhero team is supposed to look like would end up in direct conflict with a company that turned the entire idea into a business. The Avengers would arrive in the boys' universe with almost no context for what happened. This is the original 6-person team shortly after the Battle of New York, with the abilities, equipment, and relationships they've had around that period. One moment they're dealing with their own world, and the next they're standing in a version of New York that looks familiar enough to be confusing, while still feeling wrong almost immediately. Stark Tower is gone, S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't exist, and none of Tony's usual systems recognize the networks around him. Steve would notice the differences in the city first, while Natasha and Clint would start treating the situation like an intelligence failure until they had enough information to rule that out. Tony would be the one who confirms that they're dealing with something much larger. His armor could still connect to local infrastructure, public networks, and whatever civilian data is available. But every search for people and organizations they know would come back empty. There's no Nick Fury, no Avengers Initiative, and no record of the Battle of New York that they remember. Thor would have the fewest useful answers, because whatever moved them here clearly didn't bring them somewhere connected to Asgard in any way he recognizes. The public reaction would make staying unnoticed impossible. Hulk alone would attract attention the moment anyone saw him, and Thor flying through the city would be filmed for dozens of angles, before the team could decide what to do next. Tony could hide his identity behind the giant armor, but that matters less when he's moving around besides Captain America and a giant green man. Within an hour, videos of them would start spreading online. The Avengers would initially assume this world already has some kind of system for handling superhuman activity, because it becomes obvious very quickly that people aren't reacting to powers like they're seeing them for the first time. Homelander, A-Train, Starlight, and the rest of the Seven are public figures, and Vaught's branding is everywhere. Steve would probably take some comfort in that because it suggests that the planet isn't completely defenseless, while Tony would be more interested in figuring out who actually owns the operation. Their first public rescue would make that investigation much harder for Vought to control. If an accident happens nearby or a soup-related incident puts civilians at risk, Steve would move before anyone has time to discuss whether helping draws attention. Tony, Thor, Natasha, and Clint would follow naturally, while Bruce would only bring Hulk out if the situation actually needed him. That rescue would look completely different from the kind of event Vought normally stages because there's no camera coordination. There's also no sponsorship placements and nobody waiting for permission to act. The footage would spread faster than Vought can contain it. People would see Captain America directing civilians, Iron Man handling the dangerous parts of the scene, Thor carrying people out of places nobody else can reach, and Natasha and Clint working like trained responders rather than celebrities. Vought would immediately recognize that 6 unknown heroes have just appeared without any connection to Compound V, and the public has already started comparing them to the Seven before the company has even spoken to them. This gives Vought 2 problems at once. These people could become some of the most valuable heroes the company has ever seen if they can be recruited, but they also represent something Vought has spent decades trying to make impossible. If superheroes can exist outside Compound V, then Vought no longer controls the source of superhuman power. Madeline Stillwell and the upper levels of the company would push for contact before anyone else gets close to them. Homelander would be told to stay away initially, because Vought has no idea how strong Thor or Hulk really are, and provoking 6 unknown people before learning anything about them would be reckless even by their standards. Tony would find that restraint interesting. A corporation with enough authority to manage the world's most famous superheroes would normally send government officials or law enforcement first. Instead, Vought itself steps forward. That gives him his first reason to start looking deeper. Vought would approach the Avengers with the kind of polished welcome they've used on soups for years. The meeting would be framed as help rather than recruitment first. They could provide housing, transportation, information about this world, and access to resources, while the Avengers figure out whether going home is even possible. For a team stranded without S.H.I.E.L.D., that offer would be useful enough that they wouldn't reject it automatically. Steve would be cautious but open to hearing them out. He spent most of his life working with organizations that coordinate people with unusual abilities, so the basic concept wouldn't bother him. What would bother him is how much of Vaught's language revolves around branding and public approval. He'd notice quickly that every conversation about heroism turns back towards ratings, contracts, and what people want to see. It reminds him of when he had to dress up as Captain America and go on stage. Tony would be more direct about it. The labs and technical resources would interest him, especially because he needs tools if he wants any chance of understanding the dimensional event that brought him here. He'd also be evaluating Vaught's technology while pretending to care about the recruitment pitch. The company would probably think Tony is the easiest person to win over because he understands money, fame, and corporate power better than anyone else in the group. That assumption would disappear once he starts asking technical questions. Tony would want to know where the Seven's abilities come from, how Vought tests durability, what kind of medical oversight exists, and why one company controls so much data around enhanced people. Vought would answer as little as possible without making the refusal obvious. They could claim proprietary research, privacy rules, or national security arrangements, but every vague answer would make Tony more interested. Natasha would notice different things. She'd watch who enters the room, who looks towards Homelander before answering difficult questions, and which executives behave like they're afraid of their own employees. She has spent years around compromised organizations organizations and would recognize the atmosphere long before she understands the exact reason for it. Clint would catch the security setup and start noticing how many areas of the building they aren't allowed to see. Thor would care much less about the corporate side. He'd be judging the Seven as warriors, and that creates immediate tension once he actually meets them. Homelander presents himself with the confidence of someone who would expect everyone around him to recognize his superiority, while Thor comes from a culture where power like that is common enough that it doesn't automatically impress him. Thor wouldn't insult him for no reason, but he also wouldn't react with the respect Homelander is used to getting. Hulk would create an even more uncomfortable situation. Bruce would stay in control during the meeting, but Vought would already have seen enough footage to know what happens when that changes. Their scientists would be desperate to study him, and Bruce would recognize that interest instantly because he spent years dealing with people who wanted to turn Hulk into something they could use. That would be one of the first moments where Bruce warns the others. Vought may be offering help, but their interest in Hulk feels far too familiar. Steve would take that seriously because Bruce usually avoids confrontation unless something genuinely bothers him. Tony would already be suspicious. Natasha would have her own concerns, and suddenly the entire team would start looking at the building differently. Vought would still try to keep their relationship friendly. They might offer the Avengers a public appearance with the Seven as a way of introducing them to the world and controlling the growing speculation around who they are. Now, keep in mind this is 2012 Steve. He'd probably be one of the easier people to convince because he'd see an opportunity to reassure civilians and make clear that they aren't here to cause trouble. But that public appearance creates problems that Vought didn't fully anticipate. People would immediately respond to Steve. He doesn't speak like someone repeating talking points, and he has no contract telling him which causes he's allowed to support. When he talks about helping people, there's no product attached to it, and the crowd would notice that, and Homelander would notice the crowd noticing it. Tony would see the reaction too. By the end of the day, Vought would be trying to figure out how to turn the Avengers into assets, and the Avengers would already be trying to figure out what Vought is hiding. Now, Tony wouldn't need much encouragement to start looking through Vaught's systems. The access Vought has given him wouldn't contain anything directly incriminating, but it would let him use their labs and networks while studying the dimensional event. More importantly, it would let him map their network architecture and identify isolated systems that shouldn't exist on an ordinary corporate research network. He wouldn't immediately break into everything. Tony knows that if Vought notices a major intrusion too early, they'll lock down the useful systems and start watching him more closely. He'd quietly work around the security protecting these isolated sections, using the legitimate access as cover until he could penetrate one without alerting Vought. Natasha would handle the human side at the same time. She could move through Vought Tower without looking like she's investigating anything, talk to employees who assume she's just another member of the Avengers, and learn which names make people uncomfortable. Compound V would probably come up indirectly before they find the actual files because too many departments would have references to pharmaceutical testing, childhood programs, and classified research that Vought doesn't include in its public history. The first hard evidence would likely come from Tony. He'd find records showing that many supes received Compound V as children, and that Vought has known exactly where their powers came from for years. That information alone would completely change the way the Avengers understand the world. These superheroes weren't a naturally occurring group that Vought happened to organize later. The company created the conditions that produced them, and then built the public story around the results. Steve would react badly to that once Tony showed him. The idea of giving children an experimental drug without their informed consent would already be enough to turn him against the company's methods. Finding out that Vought then hides the truth and markets those same people as chosen heroes would make it worse. Steve has seen what happens when organizations convince themselves that people can be turned into tools for a larger goal. Bruce would focus on the scientific side because Compound V raises questions he understands better than anyone else in the group. He'd want to know how stable it is, how often it fails, and what happens to people who don't survive exposure. The records will likely give him more than he wanted to see. Natasha would uncover the cover-ups around the same time. She'd find reports connected to deaths, collateral damage, and incidents where Vought paid victims or pressured witnesses instead of holding supes responsible. That's where A-Train running through Robin could enter the Avengers investigation. Huey's name would be attached to the settlement process, which gives Nat a real person outside Vought they can speak to. Steve would want to contact him immediately, but Natasha would argue for caution because they don't know how closely Vought monitors anyone connected to those incidents. That's where her experience becomes useful. She'd arrange contact somewhere Vought won't expect, and Clint would watch the area from a distance in case the meeting is compromised. Huey would be shocked when Captain America and Black Widow show up asking about A-Train. He wouldn't trust them immediately because, from his perspective, they're still superheroes, and he has a very good reason to be suspicious of anyone with powers. Steve's behavior would eventually lower the tension because he wouldn't defend A-Train or Vought once Huey explained what happened. Natasha would be more interested in the settlement process, who contacted him, and what pressure was used to keep the story quiet. That conversation would eventually bring Butcher into the picture. Butcher would hate the entire situation from the moment he hears about it. 6 new superheroes have appeared out of nowhere. Vought is trying to recruit them, and now 2 of them are talking to Huey. He'd assume there's another angle until they prove otherwise. Now, Butcher wouldn't care that Steve seems sincere. He spent way too long watching supes hide behind public images to accept Captain America simply because he talks differently from Homelander. Steve would recognize that hostility immediately, and probably understand where some of it comes from once Butcher starts explaining what Vought has done. The conversation would become tense once Butcher moves from Vought to supes in general. Steve could agree that dangerous people need to be stopped without accepting the idea that power automatically makes someone corrupt. Thor standing in the same world is proof that someone can have enormous strength without working for Vought, while Bruce has spent years actively trying to keep Hulk from hurting people. Natasha and Clint don't even have powers and still chose the same work. Butcher would argue that he hasn't seen how this world changes people yet, and Tony would probably be the least patient with them. He already dislikes anyone who acts like they've figured everyone else out, and Butcher's habit of treating all supes as one problem would annoy him quickly. At the same time, Tony would realize that the boys have information the Avengers need. mean, especially once Butcher starts talking about Vought's internal operations and Homelander's history. The boys would also gain something they've never had before. They now have people capable of surviving direct retaliation from Vought. That changes every operation immediately. Butcher spent years relying on secrecy, because getting caught by the wrong soup means the entire group can die in seconds. With Thor, Hulk, and Iron Man nearby, that risk doesn't disappear, but it becomes much easier to take actions that would have been impossible before. Steve would still refuse to let the boys turn the Avengers into weapons for personal revenge. If Butcher proposes killing A-Train or another member of the Seven without giving them a chance to surrender, Steve would also shut it down. That tension would continue, because Butcher is going to keep pushing towards permanent solutions, while Steve keeps demanding evidence and control. Nat would probably be the most effective bridge between groups. She understands why Butcher operates the way he does without agreeing with all of it, and she can tell when he's withholding information. Clint would also work well with Frenchie, because both of them understand preparation, weapons, and how to handle threats stronger than themselves. This partnership between the boys and the Avengers would accelerate the investigation dramatically. Within days, the Avengers would have evidence tying Vought to Compound V, cover-ups, and deliberate manipulation of its superheroes. Tony and Bruce could analyze the drug itself. Natasha and Clint could verify internal records, while the boys provide witnesses and incidents Vought tried to bury. Homelander would notice a change before Ashley has a complete picture of it. The Avengers stop attending Vought events. Tony pulls away from their labs. Steve becomes much less willing to appear besides the Seven publicly. Bruce refuses every request to let Vought study Hulk. That would tell Homelander something is moving against them. He wouldn't attack yet, because 6 unknown heroes openly accusing Vought is already dangerous enough, and killing one of them without understanding the others could create an even bigger problem. Instead, he'd start watching them. Tony would realize soon after that somebody with enhanced senses has been paying much more attention to their movements. By then, both sides would be preparing for the possibility that the relationship is about to collapse. Homelander's biggest problem with the Avengers would develop before anyone throws a punch. The public would start liking them for reasons Vought can't easily reproduce. Steve doesn't need a marketing campaign to come across as sincere, because he genuinely believes what he says. Tony is already comfortable handling media without Vought writing every line for him, and Thor attracts attention simply by existing. Even Natasha and Clint would begin earning respect once people see footage of them fighting alongside people far stronger than themselves. For years, Vought built its entire superhero structure around Homelander. The Seven are important because he leads them, and the public image of superheroes ultimately points back towards Homelander as the strongest and most recognizable person on the planet. Now 6 outsiders have appeared, and people are treating them like heroes without Vought giving them permission. Steve would annoy Homelander the most, because the comparison would happen naturally. Both men are presented as symbols of natural heroism, but Steve has no interest in proving he's above ordinary people. He talks to civilians normally, takes responsibility when something goes wrong, and doesn't need everyone around him to act impressed. Tony would cause a different problem, because he starts publicly questioning Vought. He wouldn't release everything immediately. The team needs enough evidence to survive legal attacks and public denials. So Tony would begin with smaller questions that force Vought to respond. Where does Compound V come from? Why are there sealed medical records connected to childhood subjects? Why do so many serious incidents involving soups disappear into private settlements? Vought would deny what it can, and claim that the rest is proprietary or fabricated, and that would only make Tony keep digging. Starlight would also want to work with the Avengers, because she's seen the Seven before and been with them before. She knows how evil they are, but current members in the Seven would react differently. A-Train would feel like the Avengers are threatening his place in the Seven without even trying. Thor can cross huge distances through the air. Tony can respond to emergencies with advanced technology, and Hulk makes most of the team's heavy hitters look much less impressive. If Vought starts believing these new heroes are more valuable, A-Train and the D both know exactly how quickly the company can replace them. The Seven would start becoming less stable before the Avengers even formally oppose them. Homelander would try to stop that by confronting the group privately. He'd choose Steve to blame, because he sees him as the public face of the problem, and probably assumes Captain America is easier to intimidate than Thor or Hulk. Steve would listen to whatever warning Homelander gives him without escalating the encounter. He knows enough by now to understand that Homelander is dangerous, and starting a fight in the middle of Vought Tower would put employees and civilians at risk. Homelander would expect some sign that the message worked. Steve would leave and continue the investigation. That reaction would push Homelander further, because his normal methods rely heavily on people understanding what he can do and adjusting their behavior around it. Steve understands the danger perfectly, and still refuses to let it decide what he does. Bruce would also begin preparing for the fight that everyone can see coming. He wouldn't want Hulk involved unless it became necessary, but Homelander's strength means there's a real chance that necessary arrives sooner than anyone wants. Thor would have even fewer concerns about facing him if civilians are threatened. The Avengers would still try to be exposed Vought without turning the situation into a war. And once Vought makes its first move against the people helping the Avengers, the team would stop treating the company as something they can handle discreetly. Vought would eventually decide that waiting is becoming more dangerous than acting. Tony has copied enough internal records to expose Compound V. Natasha has identified people tied to the cover-ups, and Huey is now working with a team that can actually protect him. The company would still avoid attacking the Avengers in public because that would validate everything Tony has been saying, so they'd start with the people around them. That probably means going after the boys first. Vought already knows Huey has a reason to hate A-Train, and Butcher has been a problem for years. If the company can remove them quietly, it weakens the investigation without forcing Homelander into a public confrontation with Thor or Hulk. Black Noir would be the obvious person to send, because he can move without creating a spectacle, and has experience handling targets who know too much. But that plan would fall apart once Nat notices the pattern. She'd already expect retaliation after Homelander's warning to Steve, so the boys wouldn't be left in one location without surveillance. Clint would watch the surrounding area while Tony's systems track anything unusual approaching. approaching. Noir is still dangerous enough to get close, but the moment the attack starts, the Avengers respond before Vought can isolate anyone. Steve would focus on getting Huey and the others out. Nat and Clint wouldn't try to beat Noir head on. They'd keep him moving through traps, checkpoints, explosives, and ranged attacks long enough for Tony to arrive. Tony still wouldn't assume ordinary restraints could hold a soup whose limits he doesn't know, so he'd immobilize Noir and set a reinforced containment system designed to keep him locked down without turning the fight into an execution. That failed attack gives the Avengers something they were missing before. Vought has now directly targeted witnesses connected to the investigation, and they have evidence tying the attack back to the company. Tony wouldn't hold the files much longer after that. Since the world still doesn't know the truth about Compound V, Tony would leak the files to multiple news outlets all at once, giving them enough proof that Vought couldn't deny it. The soups themselves would start learning that they weren't born special. Their own parents let Vought inject them with Compound V as babies for money. Victims who signed settlements began recognizing the same patterns in other cases. Every statement Vought releases creates another question, because the company spent years selling soups as naturally gifted people who simply happened to work for them. The Seven would start breaking apart under pressure. A-Train would be worried about what happens if the Robin case becomes public again, while the Deep would do nothing, because he has no idea what to do, because he's stupid, with an IQ of 14. Homelander would watch his approval ratings die, and his control begin slipping at the same time. That's when he'd finally stop caring about Vaught's strategy. If the Avengers are allowed to keep talking, the world he understands disappears around him. Homelander would go after the Avengers directly, once the exposure becomes impossible to contain, and he'd probably bring whoever from the Seven is still willing to follow him. Vought may try to stop the confrontation, but by this point, Homelander is acting on his own, and the company has already lost much of its ability to manage him. The Avengers would know he's coming. Tony has been preparing since the first time Homelander confronted Steve. Steve would organize the team around keeping the fight away from civilians, instead of letting Homelander choose somewhere crowded where the Avengers have to hold back. The opening would immediately show Homelander that this team is nothing like the people he usually intimidates. Thor can meet him in the air and shrug off his deadly heat vision, easily taking hits that would kill normal soups. Hulk can force him into a physical exchange, where Homelander no longer has the comfort of knowing he's automatically the strongest person nearby. Tony doesn't need to stay close, because he can attack from range while feeding information to everyone else through the suit. Steve, Natasha, and Clint would handle the rest of the battlefield. They don't need to overpower the Seven individually if Thor and Hulk can keep Homelander occupied. Tony would track A-Train's movements through the suit and feed his projected routes to the others. Clint could cover those lanes from range, while Steve stays close to Natasha and any civilians, denying A-Train easy isolated targets. They wouldn't need to match his speed if they could keep narrowing where he could safely move. Nat would focus on keeping the team coordinated and exploiting the same kind of mistakes she spent her career looking for. Starlight would also show up to help the Avengers, but she wouldn't be very useful because she can't really do much, and Homelander would still be the biggest problem. Thor and Hulk could both hurt him, and having to deal with them together would push him harder than almost any fight he has experienced. If he tries to concentrate on Thor, Hulk gets close. If he moves towards Hulk, Thor can hit him from the air while Tony adds pressure from another angle. The fight would become less about finding one perfect attack and more about never giving Homelander enough space to control the pace. Eventually, Homelander would start losing ground. That would be hard for him to process because his entire identity is built around being untouchable. Facing several people who can survive his attacks, while the rest of the team keeps working together, would make his anger worse, and that only makes the Avengers' coordination more effective. Steve would keep the team focused on containment, because killing Homelander in the middle of the crisis creates another problem they don't need. Once Thor and Hulk have him weakened enough, Tony could bring in specialized restraints built around the information they stole from Vought and whatever they learned during the fight. It wouldn't be easy to hold him forever, but the goal at this moment is keeping him from escaping while the rest of the world watches Vought collapse. For the first time, Homelander would be beaten in a way that Vought can't edit into something else. The fallout would spread much faster than anything Vought could repair. Compound V is public, several of the company's cover-ups are exposed, and Homelander has just lost a fight against heroes Vought has spent days trying to discredit. That combination would destroy the idea that Vought is the only organization capable of managing superhero threats. The Avengers would have no interest in taking their place. Steve would make that clear, because building another company around controlling heroes only repeats the same mistake under a different name. The boys would finally have leverage that they never had before. Butcher still wouldn't suddenly become comfortable around soups, and he'd probably remain suspicious of Thor and Hulk long after everyone else starts treating the Avengers as allies. What changes is that he can no longer argue that power automatically leads to someone like Homelander when he has spent weeks watching Steve, Tony, Bruce, Thor, Natasha, and Clint repeatedly put themselves in danger without asking Vought for anything. And he may never admit that openly. Huey would have an easier time accepting it, especially after seeing Steve take his situation seriously from the beginning. Homelander's future becomes far more uncertain. If the Avengers can keep him contained, Vought loses the person who held most of the company together through fear. If he eventually escapes, he returns to a world where everyone has seen him lose, and also where Thor and Hulk are still around if he tries to rebuild that image through violence. The Seven would never recover in the same form. Some members would disappear, some would try to separate themselves from Vought, and the company would spend years dealing with investigations that began much earlier than they ever did in the OG timeline. The Avengers would still have to find a way home, but they couldn't simply ignore what they uncovered while waiting for Tony to solve that problem. As long as they remain here, Vought no longer gets to decide what a superhero is supposed to look like. The public has already seen the other side of them.